In this chapter, we're going to look at the syntax of CSS, so you'll know how to read the CSS that you see, and you'll be able to write your own CSS. So here we have a document that is formatted with CSS, and here we have that same document in the editor. And here we have the CSS style sheet. You'll see we're using an external style sheet that's called in right here, and there's the style sheet there. This is the same style sheet that we're using throughout this chapter. And so you see it is possible and common to use an external style sheet for multiple documents. And it makes it very easy to keep track of the styles and the formatting across different documents. Before we get into the syntax of the CSS itself, there's one subject that I'd like to cover in the XHTML on how the styles are applied. There's two special tags in XHTML and HTML called span and div. Div is a block level element and span is an inline element. And so they're used like this. They don't have any properties of their own, but they're used for applying style. So if I say div over here and I say style equals color blue, and then I close that down here with the end tag for div, I'll go ahead and I'll save that. Now this section of the document will come up with blue text, whereas the rest of the document will have the text that's defined in the body element in the CSS. So I'll go ahead and I'll reload this. There you have it. This section is now blue, and the rest of the document still has the color that's defined in the body element of the CSS. So that's how div works. Div is for applying style to a section of a document at the block level. In other words, these are block level elements. The H1 and the paragraph are block level elements. So I need a block level element to wrap around them so that I can have blocks inside of that tag. Likewise, if I wanted to do the same thing, but on an inline level, I would use span. So span is an inline level element that has no properties of its own but is used for applying style. So here we have span in a style of color red. So the text of this word originally will be red, whereas the rest of this paragraph will still have the color that it's inherited from this div element that we just inserted. So I'll go ahead and I'll save that, and we'll see that the word originally will now turn up red. And there we have it. And you'll notice that they inherit just as you would expect them to, because the div element is outside and the span element is inside. So span inherits its properties first from the paragraph, which is just outside of it, and then from the div, which is outside of that. So it still follows the same hierarchy as the rest of the rules for applying CSS. So let's take a look at the style sheet itself, and we'll understand some of the elements of how the style sheet works and how the syntax of the style sheet works. Here we have the word body and H1 and P. These are selectors. And so the selector is the first thing that you'll see in a style sheet. There's three different kinds of selectors. This is a tag selector, and this is a tag selector, and this is a tag selector. So these are names of tags, and you don't see any special punctuation around them. When you see a period before the name, as in the case of first and in the case of highlight, those are called class selectors, and those are applied using the class attribute in XHTML. So here, instead of using style, if I simply said class equals highlight, that selects the class style using the class selector. So I'll go ahead and save that, and we'll look at it in CSS. So we have this highlight selector with the dot before it. That makes it a class selector. So we use the class attribute to select that. So class equals highlight, and the class attribute selects that. Notice that there's no period here. We don't use the period in the name on the XHTML side. We just say the word highlight. The period is used in the CSS just to say that it's a class selector. I've saved that, and I'll go ahead and reload in the browser. And we see that now it has that bold font and the highlighting behind it. In fact, if we wanted to, we could apply the class selector to any element in the HTML. We could apply it to this A tag. We could say class equals highlight. And now the anchor, the link, will be highlighted in the HTML. See there? or we could apply it even to the entire paragraph if we wanted to. And then the entire paragraph would be highlighted like that. And that's at a block level, so it highlights all the way from margin to margin, which is how block levels work. So that's the class selector. Like I said, there's 3 different types of selectors. So we've seen 2 of them. We've seen the tag selector and we've seen the class selector. Let's take a look at the 3rd type, which is called the ID selector. So here I've created a style, and it's called Whois, and it uses an ID selector. ID selector uses a pound sign, where the class selector uses the period. So that's a pound sign, or the hash mark, the tic-tac-toe looking thing that's in the Shift 3 on my keyboard. And so that's the ID selector. So I'll go ahead and I'll save this, and we'll go into the XHTML. Take this highlight out there so it doesn't get too confusing. So you see here we have style color equals blue in div. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say ID equals Whois. And this is how this is typically used. I'll save this. So now this entire section here with the div is going to use this Whois selector, and that is an ID selector. Now the major difference between an ID selector and a class selector is that a class selector can be used over and over, whereas an ID selector can only be used once. So I'm really only allowed to use this in one place in a document. If I wanted another div around this other section here, I would have to name that something else. So this is used for marking up an entire section of a document. You might have like a main article, you might have a sidebar, you might have something else, and you can separate those sections of the document with ID selectors. And that allows you to apply a style to that whole section of the document. We'll see a number of examples of this when we look at building a website in the next chapter. But let's just take a look at how this works for now. We've set up this ID selector with the class name of Whois. And here it is, ID Whois, with the ID selector in the CSS. We'll go ahead and reload the document. And you see that this is all blue, just like we expected, because we have set it to be blue. You can make it something else just so you can see it. We'll say a 606. It'll be a sort of a purple color. And we'll save that and go ahead and reload it in here. And so that's a sort of a burgundy color there. That's how the ID selectors work. So those are the selectors, and there's 3 different kinds. Then there's a pair of curly braces, and the curly braces actually delimit the style itself. And so all of this is within the style, and it's within these curly braces. And so that's part of the body style. And then inside of the curly braces, we have the style itself. Now the style has 2 parts. It has the property part, which is to the left of the colon, and to the right of the colon, it has the value. So each of these styles, there's a background color property, a color property, font family property, and the value there is Helvetica. The value here is pound 630. The value here is pound FFC. So we have the property and the value, property, value, property, value. And then each property value combination is separated by a semicolon. So you have a semicolon there, and a semicolon there, and a semicolon there. Now technically the semicolon is not required on the last property value combination, but I usually include it when I'm writing style sheets like this. The reason is that it's just hard to keep track of which is the last thing. If I omit it here and I decide I want to add a property after it, and I say, color equals green, then it's just not going to work. You're not going to see the color equals green. You also won't see the indent. I'll go ahead and I'll save that and I'll show that to you. This is an error. And so the reason for that is that I eliminated this semicolon. I didn't use it as the last one, and then I added something and I forgot to put it in there. So if I put this back in, then we'll see the color will become green and we'll have the indent again. So that's why I go ahead and I use them anyway, even though they're not required on the last element. They're technically supposed to be separators, and most people will use them as terminators instead. And in other words, they'll put them on every line, and that's the reason for that, because otherwise you have to keep track of it, and it's just too hard to do. So there you have it. That is the syntax of the CSS. You have the selector, you have the curly braces, you have the properties and values, you have your semicolons. I just want to cover one other thing that's easy to get wrong. And I'm going to do this here. I'm going to say in this div, instead of saying ID equals who is, I'm going to go ahead and put in a style using the style attribute. And I'm going to say color equals green. And we're going to try and set the color here. And it's not going to work because I've made a mistake. I've made a very, very common mistake. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that. And we'll load it up over here. And we'll see that the color is not green. Can you see the mistake? Aha, I used an equal sign instead of a colon. The colon and the space isn't required, but I like putting a space after a colon, and most people do. Not everybody, though. You won't always see the space. And I made this mistake because I'm so used to in HTML and in XHTML typing an equal sign. And so oftentimes I'll set up a style in my XHTML like that, and I'll use an equal sign, and I won't notice, and I'll save it, and I'll load it up, and it won't be working. And I'll say, why isn't that working? And sometimes it'll take me a while before I notice that I used an equal sign instead of a colon. So I'm just warning you. You'll see that this works now. I'll go ahead and load that up, and now it's green. It works with the colon. It does not work with the equal sign. So that's just something that you can be on the watch out for. It's a little gotcha that happens a lot when you're writing the CSS in the XHTML file using the style attribute like that. So there you have it. That's the syntax of CSS. That's how CSS works. We also talked about the div and the span tags, which are really useful for applying style in a document.